The elderly millionaire sat alone at the grand dining table, tears streaming down her face. It was the cleaner who approached, wiped her tears, and whispered something no one expected to hear. Her rich son was left in shock. Those simple words changed everything. The tropical downpour lashed mercilessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Fullerton residence, a property so imposing that neighbors quietly referred to it as the Palace of Forgotten Memories. Its soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and meticulously manicured gardens spoke of wealth accumulated over decades. But that night, amidst all the opulence, something was profoundly broken. Seated at the head of a table that could comfortably seat 20, Mrs. Evelyn Tan barely occupied a small corner of her vast world. Before her, a plate of untouched food, a glass of red wine trembling slightly in her aged fingers, and an empty chair at the far end of the table that seemed to scream in silence. The woman stared at that chair as if expecting someone to return to it, as if at any moment the years could roll back and bring back what time had taken without permission. It was then that the first tear fell. It wasn't a dramatic sob. It wasn't the kind of crying that seeks attention. It was worse. It was the kind of silent, deep weeping that only comes when a person has learned to suffer alone for too long. A slow tear, almost resigned, tracing the wrinkles on her face as if it knew each path by heart. No one in that enormous mansion seemed to notice. The grandfather clocks continued their indifferent ticking. The fire in the fireplace crackled without mercy. And Mrs. Evelyn Tan remained motionless, that empty chair before her like a thorn no one could remove. No one, except Siti. Miss Siti Rahman had only been working as a cleaner at the Fullerton residence for a few weeks. She was a young woman, a mother to a small girl, who had come to that door out of necessity and had stayed for something she couldn't quite name. From the first day, she had noticed that in this house so full of beautiful things, something essential was missing, a human warmth that no chandelier could replace. That night, Siti was quietly cleaning the corridor next to the dining room when she heard a sound so faint that anyone else would have ignored it, but not her. She knew that sound from within because she had produced it herself on dark nights she preferred not to remember. It was the exact sound of weeping trying not to be heard. She paused, holding the cloth in her hands, looking towards the half-open dining room door. She could have kept walking. She could have pretended not to hear. Her contract had no clause asking her to attend to anyone's pain. She was a cleaner, not a nurse, not a therapist, not family. But there are moments in life when the human heart doesn't consult contracts. Siti placed the cloth on the trolley and walked towards the dining room door. What she saw stopped her cold. Mrs. Evelyn Tan, the woman employees described as imposing and distant, seemed incredibly small at that moment, small and lost within her own mansion, surrounded by luxury and utterly alone. Her shoulders slumped, her hands trembling around the glass, her gaze fixed on that empty chair with an intensity that could only come from a love that no longer had anywhere to go. Siti took a deep breath. She stepped inside. Mrs. Tan, she said softly, almost as if not wanting to break something fragile floating in the air. The elderly woman didn't respond immediately. She continued to stare at the empty chair as if Siti didn't exist, but a second tear betrayed her silence. And that was enough. Siti approached slowly, took a linen napkin from the table, and with a delicacy learned not from any training but from the school of her own pain, she knelt slightly beside the elderly woman and wiped the tear from her cheek. Mrs. Evelyn Tan tensed. No employee had ever crossed that line. No one in that mansion had dared to touch her with that kind of tenderness in a very, very long time. Her eyes, filled with tears, slowly shifted towards Siti with a mix of surprise and something that looked like fear. The strange fear felt by someone unaccustomed to receiving comfort. "You didn't have to bother," Mrs. Evelyn Tan murmured, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't used it for hours. "It's no trouble," Siti replied softly. There was a silence, one of those silences that speak more than 1,000 words. "This chair," the elderly woman said suddenly, looking back towards the opposite end of the table. "It was occupied for over 50 years. Every night, without fail." She paused for a long time. Her fingers tightened around the glass. "And now, it's been empty for so long that I don't know if it was he who left or if it was me." Siti felt a tightening in her chest. She said nothing. Sometimes the best comfort has no words. "My husband, Mr. Andrew," the elderly woman continued, as if the floodgates of something very deep had begun to yield. "He sat there every night. Even if he arrived late from his travels, even if he was tired, even if the world was falling apart outside, he always came to that chair. Always." Her voice broke on the last word. He used to say that as long as we both sat together at this table, nothing could be truly wrong. Siti looked at the empty chair, and for a moment, could almost see the silhouette of that man who had left such a large void. "How long has it been empty?" she asked gently. "Too long," Mrs. Evelyn Tan replied. And that answer, so short and so definitive, contained entire years of solitude. It was then that Siti did something no one in that mansion would have expected. Without calculating, without thinking about hierarchies or distances, she took the elderly woman's cold hand in hers. "Mrs." Evelyn Tan stiffened for a second. Then, very slowly, her hand responded. Her fingers closed around Siti's with a trembling strength that said everything her mouth hadn't been able to say in years. And then Siti leaned in and whispered something into the elderly woman's ear. Words no one else heard. Words that made Mrs. Evelyn Tan close her eyes, and a tear, different from all the previous ones, well up. Not a tear of pure pain, but a tear of something akin to relief. What neither of them knew at that moment was that there was a witness. David Tan, Mrs. Evelyn Tan's only son, had arrived at the mansion without warning that night. A businessman, accustomed to managing millions with the same coldness with which others handle papers, David had entered through the main door just in time to see the scene from the dining room threshold. He stopped. He said nothing. He couldn't. He saw his mother, the woman he believed strengthened by years of character and distance, weeping unashamedly while a cleaning employee held her hand. He saw the linen napkin on the table. He saw his father's empty chair, and he saw something that struck him in a place he had kept locked away for a long time. He saw that his mother was not well. She hadn't been well in a long time, and he hadn't wanted to see it. His hand slowly rose to his mouth. David Tan, owner of companies, a man who never lost his composure in a boardroom, felt his legs tremble. Not because he was angry with the employee, not because what he saw seemed inappropriate, but because what he heard at that moment, barely the echo of the words Siti had whispered to his mother, left him completely paralyzed. Because those words he knew, he had heard them before, in another voice, in another time of his life that he believed buried forever. And in that instant, as the rain continued to beat against the windows of the Fullerton residence, David understood that he had not arrived by chance. That night, that something or someone had brought him exactly when he needed to be there. The question that burned in his throat as he stood motionless on the threshold was simple and devastating at the same time. Who was this woman who cleaned the floors of his house, really? David Tan did not sleep that night. He sat in the leather armchair in his old room, the same one where he had grown up, the same one his mother had kept intact as if time had no permission to touch anything within that mansion. The high ceiling, the ivory walls, the books arranged on the shelf exactly as he had left them years ago. All the same, all still, all but him. The words he had heard on the dining room threshold kept swirling in his head like a melody he couldn't turn off. They weren't complicated words. They weren't phrases from a philosopher or a poet. They were simple, brief words, spoken so softly that he had barely caught them. But precisely because of that, they had shattered him inside. Because those specific words, in that specific order, pronounced with that particular cadence, he had heard them before, long before, at a time in his life that he had decided never to reopen. He stood up, walked to the window. The rain had ceased, and now the dawn revealed the drenched garden, his mother's roses gleaming under the faint light of the exterior lanterns. Everything so perfect on the outside, everything so silent on the inside. Who was Siti Rahman? That question left him breathless. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't a boss's distrust of an employee. It was something deeper and inexplicable, a sensation that ran down his spine like an electric current every time he tried to reconstruct the scene. A young, unknown woman who had only been in that house for weeks, who had, without hesitation, crossed a line that no employee in decades had dared to cross. And his mother, the most reserved and proud woman he had ever known, had allowed her to hold her hand, had allowed her to approach, had allowed her to console her, because David knew better than anyone what it cost to earn Mrs. Evelyn Tan's trust. He himself, her son, had spent years feeling an invisible wall between them, a wall that grew after Mr. Andrew's death, when their shared grief, instead of uniting them, had separated them into two distinct islands, with no bridge between them. Mrs. Evelyn Tan had turned her grief into silence. David had turned his into work, into money, into meetings that started at dawn and ended past midnight. Two different ways to escape the same emptiness. And yet, that night, a stranger had achieved in minutes what he hadn't been able to achieve in years. That was what pained him most, and what he most needed to understand. The next morning, the Fullerton residence awoke to its usual routine. The staff began their tasks before the sun had fully risen. Auntie Mei Ling, the cook, prepared breakfast with her usual precision. Uncle Raj, the gardener, walked the paths with his tool cart, and Siti arrived punctually, as she did every day, with her cleaning trolley and that calm demeanor that several of the staff had already noticed. She didn't talk excessively, didn't ask what didn't concern her, but she had a way of moving through the house that made the spaces feel more lived in after she had passed through them. David observed her from the main staircase without her noticing. He watched her clean the foyer with methodical but never mechanical movements. He saw her pause in front of a family photograph on the wall, a picture showing Mr. Andrew, Mrs. Evelyn Tan, and a teenage David, and look at it for a moment with an expression he couldn't decipher from a distance. It wasn't the curiosity of a new employee exploring the house. It was something else, something more personal. David slowly descended the stairs. "Good morning," he said when he was close enough. Siti calmly turned. She wasn't startled. He noticed that too. "Good morning, Mr. Tan," she replied with a serene voice, and returned to her work without any sign of discomfort. "I want to speak with you," David said, his tone more direct than he had planned. Siti placed the cloth on the trolley. She looked at him directly, without lowering her eyes, without the submissive posture he, without realizing it, had expected to find. "Of course," she said simply. David led her to the library, a room his father had loved, and which now remained almost always closed. He pushed the door open, and they were greeted by the distinct smell of old books and polished wood. He sat on the edge of the desk and looked directly at her. "Last night, I saw you with my mother," he began. "I know," Siti replied, unperturbed. "I heard you come in." That caught him by surprise. He expected defensiveness. He expected nervous explanations, not that almost disconcerting calm. "And you didn't think it was inappropriate?" he asked, choosing his words carefully. Siti thought for a moment before responding, not because she didn't know what to say, but as if she were deciding how much to say. "What I saw was a woman crying alone," she said. "I didn't see the owner of a mansion. I saw a person who needed someone to tell her she wasn't completely alone in the world." She paused briefly. "If that was inappropriate, then yes, it was, and I would do it again." David felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was something uncomfortable and hard to name, like when one hears a truth that they had been avoiding for a long time. "What did you say to her?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Siti looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes didn't evade his. "That is between your mother and me," she replied with absolute calm. David didn't expect that answer. No one had said anything like that to him in many years. He was Mr. Tan, the owner of the mansion, the man who signed the checks, the one who made the decisions. And this woman, with complete naturalness and without any aggression, was simply telling him that some things were not his business. It was at that moment, in that tense silence that followed, when he decided to change his strategy. "Where did you work before coming here?" he asked. "In different places," Siti replied. "Office cleaning, some homes. Nothing very different from this. And before that..." A barely perceptible pause, so brief that anyone else wouldn't have noticed it. "I was studying," Siti said, "but life changed direction, and I had to adapt." "What were you studying?" Another silence, this time longer. "Nursing," she finally replied. "I was almost done. I only had a little left." David looked at her with different attention. Nursing. That explained something about the serenity with which she handled emotionally tense situations. That way of approaching without invading, of touching without aggression. It wasn't just instinct, it was also training, albeit incomplete. "Why did you stop?" Siti took a soft breath. "Because my daughter arrived before I finished," she said with a simplicity that asked for no pity. And at that moment, she was the priority. "She still is." David nodded slowly. He studied her face, looking for something he didn't quite know what it was. A sign, a coincidence, something to explain the disturbing feeling that had kept him awake. "Do you have family here in the city?" he asked, sounding more personal than he intended. Siti looked at him with a calm that began to seem almost supernatural to him. "Just my daughter," she replied. "It's just the two of us." "Where are you originally from?" This time the pause was unmistakable. Not long, not dramatic, but real. "From a small town," she said. "One you probably don't know." And in that answer, there was something. David didn't know what, but there was something. That afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn Tan descended into the garden for the first time in weeks. The staff noticed it. Auntie Mei Ling peeked her head out of the kitchen window with an expression of genuine surprise. Uncle Raj stopped his trolley and watched the elderly woman walk slowly along the stone path among the roses, leaning on her cane with her back a little straighter than usual. Siti was cleaning the living room windows when she saw the elderly woman come out. She did nothing. She continued with her work, but her eyes followed her through the glass with discreet attention. It was Mrs. Evelyn Tan, who stopped in front of the window and looked at her. She made a small gesture with her head, almost imperceptible, a kind of greeting that carried something much heavier than simple courtesy. Siti responded with the same gesture. David, who was observing from the terrace with a coffee that was already cold, saw the exchange, so brief, so silent, so charged, and something stirred within him with an unexpected force. That night, after dinner, David entered his study and called Marcus Lee, the trusted man who handled all matters requiring discretion for him. Marcus wasn't a detective, but he had contacts. He knew how to move, how to find things people preferred to keep hidden. "I need you to investigate someone," David said without preamble. "A new employee, Siti Rahman. I want to know everything. Where she comes from, what she's done, who she really is." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Did something happen?" Marcus asked. "I don't know yet," David replied. "That's why I need you to find out." What Marcus found in the following days was not what David expected. Siti Rahman was exactly what she appeared to be on paper. A hard-working woman, no record of any kind, with a small daughter who had held various cleaning jobs since abandoning her nursing studies. No serious debts, no legal conflicts, no red flags. But there was one thing, just one thing that Marcus highlighted in the report he delivered in person, because it was the kind of data that shouldn't be sent by any digital means. The small town Siti Rahman originated from a small town that didn't appear easily on major maps. A town that David knew, that he had visited once many years ago under circumstances he had never mentioned to anyone, not even his mother. David read the name of that town 3 times in a row. Then he closed the report, folded it slowly, and stared at the wall in front of him for an indeterminate amount of time. There was something else in the report. The name of Siti's daughter's father had never appeared in any official document. No record, no mention, as if that part of Siti's story had been carefully erased or simply never written. David stood up so abruptly that the chair scraped against the wooden floor. He walked to the window, his hands resting on the frame, his gaze lost in the nocturnal garden, where his mother's roses glowed under the moon. The town, the time, the years. He began to do calculations he didn't want to do, calculations his hands rejected, but that his mind completed on its own, with cruel, automatic precision. And when the numbers aligned, when the chronology fit in a way that left no room for coincidence, David Tan, the man who never lost control, had to lean his forehead against the cold glass of the window to keep from falling. Because if what he was thinking was true, if that possibility his mind had just constructed had any real basis, then Siti Rahman had not come to the Fullerton residence by chance. And the words she had whispered to his mother were not the words of a stranger. They were the words of someone who knew exactly who she was talking to. And what terrified him most, what had left him breathless leaning against that glass in the darkness, was not the possibility of having been deceived. It was the devastating and completely opposite possibility that no one had deceived him, that everything was true, and that he, all those years, had let that truth live in the shadows without doing anything about it. There was a photograph in Siti's wallet that no one had ever seen. It wasn't a large photo. It was a small clipping, worn by the years and by the number of times it had been folded and unfolded in moments of solitude. It showed a young woman holding a newborn baby, and behind them, barely visible, the profile of a small town with red-roofed houses and a central square with a huge tree that shaded half a block. Siti looked at that photo every night before sleeping, not out of nostalgia, but to remind herself where she came from, how much she had carried, and why she couldn't afford to give up. That morning, as she prepared her cleaning trolley in the supply room of the Fullerton residence, Siti heard footsteps she recognized without needing to turn around. Sure, measured steps, with the specific weight of someone accustomed to spaces opening at their passage. David. But this time he didn't enter. He stopped on the threshold, and in that brief silence preceding his words, Siti knew that something had changed since their conversation in the library. Something in him had shifted, though he still didn't quite know in what direction. "My mother asked about you this morning," David said before she arrived. She asked if Siti had arrived yet. Siti processed that in silence while arranging the bottles on the trolley. "And does that bother you?" she asked directly, without turning around. A pause. "It surprises me," he replied with an honesty that clearly cost him something. Siti looked at him. Then she looked at him with that direct gaze that still disconcerted him, as if her eyes were accustomed to going to the heart of things without asking permission. "Your mother is a woman who has been keeping things for a long time that are too heavy to carry alone," Siti said. "Sometimes, all a person needs is for someone to show them they don't have to keep doing it." David didn't respond, but he didn't leave either, and that was the first real indication that something in him had begun to move. That afternoon, Siti picked up her daughter from the small neighborhood childcare center, 40 minutes from the mansion by public transport. The girl ran out with the overflowing energy children have when the world still seems completely manageable and jumped into her mother's arms with disproportionate force for her size. "Mama," she cried, burying her face in Siti's neck. "Hello, my love," Siti murmured, closing her eyes for a second. The girl's name was Valentina. She had dark, wavy hair, large eyes, and a way of observing the world with an attention that sometimes frightened the adults around her. She was serious for her age, but with flashes of genuine joy that lit up any room she entered. That night, while they ate dinner in their small apartment, Valentina drew in her notebook with the absolute concentration only children can devote to something. Siti washed the dishes and observed her out of the corner of her eye, as always, searching in every gesture of her daughter for some clue to what she couldn't ask directly. "Mama," Valentina said, without looking up from her drawing, "the lady from the big house is a good person." Siti paused. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you come back different when you come from there," the girl said with the brutal, undeniable logic of childhood. "Not sad, just different, like when you read Grandpa's letters." Siti slowly dried her hands with the kitchen towel, approached the table, and sat opposite her daughter. Valentina looked up from her notebook. "The lady from the big house is a very good woman," Siti said carefully. "She carries a lot of pain inside." "Like ours?" Valentina asked without drama, with the naturalness of someone who has grown up knowing that pain exists and doesn't always have a simple explanation. Siti felt a tightening in her throat. "Yes," she finally said, "like ours." Valentina nodded with that small gravity that characterized her and returned to her drawing. Siti watched her for a long moment, studying her features, that particular mix of traits that sometimes filled her with tenderness and sometimes hurt her in a way she couldn't explain to anyone. Because Valentina had her mother's eyes, but the shape of her jaw, the way she frowned when she thought, her straight posture, and that innate confidence when looking into someone's eyes, that didn't come from Siti, and Siti knew it. Every time she looked at her daughter, she knew it and kept silent, as she had for years. Back at the Fullerton residence, 2 days later, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Evelyn Tan asked to have breakfast served in the garden. Auntie Mei Ling almost spilled the coffee in surprise. Uncle Raj, who was pruning the roses when he heard the instruction, stopped with his shears in midair. In the memory of the mansion's staff, Mrs. Evelyn Tan hadn't had breakfast in the garden for years, not since before Mr. Andrew fell ill. Since a time everyone remembered as when the house still breathed. Siti prepared the outdoor table without comment. A white tablecloth, freshly squeezed orange juice, the bread Auntie Mei Ling baked every morning that filled the entire ground floor with a scent that was itself a form of embrace. When Mrs. Evelyn Tan came out leaning on her cane and saw the table prepared next to the roses, she paused. She looked at the arrangement with an expression Siti couldn't quite classify. It wasn't pure joy, it was something more complex. The kind of emotion that appears when one returns to a beloved place and discovers they can still feel something seeing it. "Andrew planted these roses," Mrs. Evelyn Tan said softly, almost to herself, as she slowly sat down. "He used to say that roses were the only honest plant in the garden. They didn't pretend to be what they weren't. If they lacked water, they showed it. If they were well cared for, they bloomed without apology." Siti poured the coffee in silence. "You also take good care of what's yours, don't you?" Mrs. Evelyn Tan said suddenly, looking at her with those eyes that saw too much. Siti looked up. "I try," she replied. "What's your daughter's name?" The question came without warning, direct and serene. Siti didn't expect it at that moment. She held the coffee pot with both hands and replied, "Valentina." Mrs. Evelyn Tan repeated the name very softly, as if measuring it, as if seeking its exact weight. "Pretty name," she finally said. "Strong, one that doesn't bend easily." Then she took her coffee and looked at the roses with that thoughtful expression that in recent days had replaced the lost and blank gaze the staff knew too well. It was that same afternoon when the first real crack appeared between David and his mother. David had spent the morning on business calls from the study, but his concentration was a farce. Every time he heard footsteps in the corridor, he looked up. Every time he recognized Siti's calm voice responding to some household instruction, something within him tensed in a way he could no longer attribute solely to distrust. Marcus Lee had called that morning to confirm an additional detail he had found in his investigation. A small detail, but one that David had spent hours turning over in his mind like a hot stone. The surname of Valentina, Siti's daughter, in the only school document where she was registered, was only her mother's, Rahman, with no paternal surname, no field completed in the corresponding section, a blank space that, in official documents, appeared as a simple missing data point, but which for David, with all he already knew, felt like an abyss. In the mid-afternoon, he went down to the living room and found his mother sitting on the sofa with a book open on her lap that she clearly wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on the window overlooking the garden. "I need to talk to you," David said, closing the door behind him. Mrs. Evelyn Tan didn't turn immediately. When she did, there was something in her gaze that he knew well, the look of someone who already knows what's coming and has decided not to evade it. "Sit down," she said simply. David sat opposite her, clasped his hands, searching for words with the same precision with which he assembled a strategy in a boardroom, but words didn't obey the same way when the heart was involved. "Do you know something about Siti?" he finally asked. "Something I don't." The silence that followed was one of those that had its own texture. "What do you know, David?" his mother replied. And the use of his name, so direct and so infrequent from her, struck him in an unexpected way. "I know where she comes from," he said carefully. "I know the name of the town." Mrs. Evelyn Tan didn't blink. "And does that tell you something?" she asked. "It tells me too much," he replied, his voice hoarser than he intended. "Or perhaps nothing. I don't know. That's why I'm asking you." The elderly woman closed the book on her lap with a calm that David had always found unfair. That calm his mother displayed, precisely when things became most difficult, as if she had learned to breathe slower just as the world sped up. "There are things people carry alone for a long time," Mrs. Evelyn Tan said. "Not because they want to, but because no one offers them a safe place to deposit them." She paused for a long time. "Siti told me something the other day that I'm not going to repeat to you. Not because it's a secret against you, but because there are truths that each person has to discover in their own time and in their own order." "Mother," David said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't appeared in years. A real vulnerability, without the executive polish. "If there's something I should know, there are many things you should know, Mrs." Evelyn Tan interrupted him with a gentleness that cut more than any reproach. "You haven't come to this house for years except to review papers and sign documents. You have spent years looking through me instead of looking at me." Her voice didn't rise, didn't tremble. It was worse than that. It was completely serene. "Your father left, David, and instead of that bringing us closer, each of us went our separate ways to carry that burden alone. I in this house, you in your businesses, and here we've been, without truly talking, without truly asking, until a stranger came to wipe away the tears we ourselves haven't been able to wipe from each other." The silence that fell after those words was absolute. David didn't respond. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Because his mother had just said aloud something he had known for years and had chosen to ignore with an almost professional dedication. "Mrs. Evelyn Tan looked at him with those tired and lucid eyes at the same time. "I'm not blaming you, son," she finally said. And in that word, son, there was a tenderness he hadn't heard in so long that it hurt him physically. "I'm telling you that we still have time, both of us. But for that, you have to stop investigating people and start looking at yourself." David felt something break somewhere in his chest, not abruptly, but slowly, like ice melting in spring, not shattering, but dissolving. He stood up, walked to the window, and outside, in the garden, he saw something he didn't expect to see. Siti was collecting the breakfast cups that had been left on the outdoor table, and next to her, sitting in the chair where Mrs. Evelyn Tan had been that morning, there was a girl with dark, wavy hair drawing something in a notebook, with the total concentration of someone creating something important. David held his breath. The girl looked up from her notebook at that moment, as if sensing someone was watching her, and looked directly towards the window where he stood. And David Tan, a man of the world, a businessman, a man who thought he had seen everything, felt the ground move beneath his feet, because that girl's eyes, the shape of her jaw, her straight posture, and that particular way of holding the pencil between her fingers exactly as his own father had always held it, exactly as he himself had done since childhood, a gesture so specific and so private that he had never seen it in anyone else in the world. Everything came together. The town, the time, the missing surname, the whispered words his mother refused to repeat. Everything clicked into place in one devastating and perfect second. David placed his open hand on the window glass as if he needed something solid to cling to. Behind him, without turning, his mother spoke one last time. "Sometimes life sends us back what we once let go, Mrs. Evelyn Tan said very softly. "The question is not whether you deserve it or not. The question is, what are you going to do now that you can no longer look away?" David didn't move from the window for a long time. The girl in the garden had returned to her notebook with that absolute concentration she had, completely oblivious to the earthquake she had unknowingly caused. Siti collected the cups with calm movements, without looking up at the window, without giving any sign of knowing someone was watching her from inside. But David was sure she knew. That certainty disturbed him almost as much as everything else. Behind him, Mrs. Evelyn Tan had resumed her book with that calm he now understood differently. It wasn't indifference. It was the calm of someone who has waited a long time for an inevitable moment to arrive, and when it finally does, no longer needs to rush it. His mother knew since when, he couldn't determine, but she knew, and had chosen to wait for him to come to the edge of that truth on his own feet. David turned away from the window without saying anything more. He went up to his room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. He needed to think, but thought didn't work when his heart was beating like this. There was a time David had buried with an efficiency he himself had confused with strength. Years ago, long before his name appeared in business pages, long before the Fullerton residence became the only place his mother lived alone with her silence, David had spent a season away from the city, a season his parents knew as the training journey that Mr. Andrew had insisted he take before officially joining the family business. A time to get to know the real world, his father had said, to understand that life doesn't begin or end in an office. David had arrived at that small town of red roofs and a central square almost by accident, following a route a fellow traveler had recommended. He had stayed longer than planned, weeks that turned into months. And in that town, in that time suspended between what he was and what he was going to be, he had met a girl who studied at the local institute with a determination that he found admirable and beautiful in equal measure. A girl with dark hair and direct eyes who didn't lower her gaze before anyone. They had met, they had truly gotten to know each other, in that deep way that only happens when two people haven't yet learned to fully protect themselves. They had shared months of an honesty David had not found again in any boardroom or any subsequent relationship. And then Mr. Andrew had called. The business needed the sun. The family needed the air. The future couldn't keep waiting in a small town no one had heard of. David had left, not abruptly, not with deliberate cruelty, but he had left with promises that time gradually diluted, and with the silent cowardice of someone who chooses not to look back. Because looking back has a cost he isn't willing to pay. He never knew if she had tried to contact him. In those days, it wasn't so easy to find someone who didn't want to be found. And he, deep down, in that dark place where we keep the truths that shame us, had done nothing to facilitate that contact. Years later, when the weight of that decision appeared in some moment of nocturnal silence, David pushed it down with work, with meetings, with the convenient narrative that he was too young then, that he had no choice, that circumstances had been bigger than him. But sitting now on the edge of that bed, with Valentina's image etched in his eyes, those narratives crumbled like wet paper. He had had a choice, he always had, and he had chosen wrong. The next morning, David came down before anyone else. He sat in the kitchen while Auntie Mei Ling prepared breakfast and waited with a patience he didn't feel, but forced himself to maintain. When he heard the familiar sound of the cleaning trolley in the corridor, he stood up. Siti entered the kitchen to collect her morning supplies and found him standing there. This time there was no strategic pause or boss employee distance. David was simply standing by the table with a cup of coffee in his hands and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't the expression of the interrogator. It was the expression of the man who had finally stopped doing so. "Yesterday, I saw your daughter in the garden," David said. Siti didn't respond immediately. She left the trolley by the door and looked at him. "I know," she said. "She told me." She said a man was watching her from the upstairs window. David felt the soft blow of those words. Just a man, nothing more, nothing less. A girl who knew nothing, looking at a man who suddenly knew too much. "Why did you bring her here?" he asked, his voice soft, without accusation. "Her childcare center closed yesterday for maintenance," Siti replied. "I had nowhere to leave her. Your mother told me it was no problem for her to come." His mother, Mrs. Evelyn Tan, had authorized Valentina's presence in the mansion. David processed that in silence. His mother, who knew or sensed the truth, had opened the door of that house to that girl without consulting him. Not out of carelessness. Mrs. Evelyn Tan did nothing carelessly. "Siti," David said, and it was the first time he used her name directly, without the formality of Miss or the distance of the employee. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that I'm not asking you as the owner of this house. I'm asking you as—" He stopped. He searched for the right word and couldn't find it. "I'm asking you because I need to know the truth." Siti looked at him for a long moment, those direct eyes that evaded nothing. "How old is Valentina?" David asked. The silence that followed was one that changes things forever. Siti did not respond immediately. She breathed slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was completely serene, without drama, without tears, with the particular serenity of someone who has rehearsed this moment in her head for so long that when it finally arrives, she has no energy left for theater. "The years you already calculated," she simply said. The coffee in David's cup grew cold. He didn't notice. "Why did you come here?" he asked, and now his voice was barely a whisper. "To this house? To this specific job? Why here?" Siti took a breath. "Because Valentina one day asked me if she had a grandmother," she said, "and I didn't know what to answer her." She paused briefly but meaningfully. "I didn't come to claim anything. I didn't come to cause any harm. I came because my daughter has a grandmother she doesn't know exists, and I thought at least one of the two outstanding debts could be settled without destroying anything." David felt something within him break with surgical precision. It wasn't a noisy collapse. It was worse. It was the silent and complete understanding of the magnitude of what he had left behind without looking. "And me?" he asked. And in that two-word question lay entire years of unsaid things. Siti looked at him with an expression that was not hatred, not resentment. It was something much harder to sustain. Absolute, unadorned honesty. "You," Siti said, "are a decision Valentina will have to make when she is old enough to understand what it means." "I didn't come to make it for her." David spent the rest of the morning in the garden, not with any apparent purpose, simply sitting on one of the stone benches next to the roses his father had planted, looking without seeing, processing without being able to finish processing. It was Valentina who approached. She arrived with her notebook under her arm and sat on the other end of the bench, with that naturalness children have, who haven't yet learned to measure social distances. She looked at him without any discomfort. "Are you the lady's son?" she asked directly. David looked at her closely. It was even more striking. Those eyes, that posture. "Yes," he replied. "She talks about you," Valentina said with total normalcy, opening her notebook. "She says you work a lot." "She told you that?" "She told me that those who work a lot sometimes forget important things," the girl replied with that devastating precision only childhood possesses. "But it's not because they're bad, it's because they got scared of something and didn't know how to stop." David couldn't speak for several seconds. Valentina was already drawing, oblivious to what her words had just done inside the man sitting beside her. She drew with that total concentration he already knew in her, the pencil moving with a certainty that didn't match her age. Her head slightly tilted to the right, exactly as he tilted his when he concentrated, exactly as Mr. Andrew had done all his life. David looked at that small, serious profile and felt his eyes fill with something he hadn't allowed himself for years. He didn't hold it back. No, this time a tear slowly rolled down his cheek, and he did nothing to stop it. "What's your drawing called?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. Valentina looked at him for a moment and then returned to her notebook. "It doesn't have a name yet," she said. "Important drawings don't have a name until they're finished." David nodded slowly. "That's a good rule," he murmured. Valentina looked at him out of the corner of her eye with an expression that, for a fleeting and devastating second, was exactly the same expression Mr. Andrew had when something seemed right to him. But he didn't want to say it aloud so as not to ruin the moment. And David Tan, who had built empires and survived crises that would have broken anyone, remained seated on that stone bench next to a girl who didn't know who he was, silently weeping among the roses his father had planted with his own hands. Inside the mansion, behind the living room window, Mrs. Evelyn Tan watched the scene with her hands clasped over her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. That night, the Fullerton residence fell silent earlier than usual. Auntie Mei Ling cleared the kitchen. Uncle Raj locked the garden gates, and the staff retired one by one until only the soft lights of the corridors remained and the familiar sound of the house breathing in the darkness. "Misus," Evelyn Tan had retired to her room after dinner without saying much, but with something different in her step, something lighter. As if that afternoon in the garden, watching her son cry next to a girl who didn't yet know she was his daughter, had loosened a knot that had been tight somewhere in her chest for years. David didn't sleep. He stayed in the study, with the lights low in front of his father's desk, surrounded by the books and objects Mr. Andrew had touched for decades. There was a pen on the desk that his father used to sign important documents, not because it was necessary in times when everything was digital, but because Mr. Andrew believed that important things deserved the weight of a real physical gesture. A signature is a promise, he always said, and promises are not made with a click. David picked up the pen between his fingers. He held it exactly as his father held it, exactly as Valentina held her pencil that afternoon in the garden. He closed his eyes. There was a chain of gestures that traveled from generation to generation, without asking permission, regardless of distances, silences, or lost years, a chain he had tried to ignore, and which that afternoon, on that stone bench, next to the roses, had shown him that ignoring it was as useless as trying to stop water with his hands. Valentina existed, had existed for years, and he had not been there. That truth had no mitigating factors or excuses to lighten it. He had turned it over from every possible angle for hours, and always arrived at the same place. There was a girl in the world who carried his blood, who had his gestures, who drew with his same head tilt, and he had not been present in any of her days, not out of ignorance, but out of cowardice, disguised as circumstance. Siti arrived the next morning with Valentina again. The childcare center was still closed, and Mrs. Evelyn Tan had personally insisted, through Auntie Mei Ling, that the girl could stay at the mansion for as long as necessary. Siti had hesitated, not because she didn't trust the elderly woman, but because the situation was becoming more complex than she had calculated when she made the decision to come and work at that house. She had calculated many things before taking that step. She had thought about the risks, the possible reactions, the scenarios that could unfold, but she had not calculated the speed. She had not calculated that in such a short time, the truth would find its own ways without asking for instructions. Valentina entered the mansion with her notebook under her arm and greeted Auntie Mei Ling with that small, serious formality that the cook already found completely adorable. Auntie Mei Ling had prepared a glass of chocolate milk and a slice of the morning bread for her, and Valentina received it with a natural grace that made the cook put her hand to her heart as soon as the girl turned towards the corridor. "That child," Auntie Mei Ling murmured to herself with shining eyes. "She has something that can't be learned." What Auntie Mei Ling didn't know was that Mrs. Evelyn Tan, who had come down silently and was standing on the dining room threshold, had heard that comment and had received it with an expression that blended the deepest pride with the oldest pain, in that particular proportion, known only by those who love something they cannot yet fully call their own. David found his mother in the garden before noon. Mrs. Evelyn Tan was sitting on the stone bench where he had been with Valentina the previous afternoon. Her hands were on her knees, and she looked at the roses with the attention she gave to things when she wanted to remember them well. David sat beside her. There was no preamble, no construction of words. He simply sat and allowed the silence between them to be, for the first time in years, an honest silence instead of an evasive one. "When did you know?" he finally asked. Mrs. Evelyn Tan did not pretend not to understand the question. "From the first day I saw her," she replied calmly. "There are things a mother recognizes, and there are gestures that blood repeats, no matter how much time has passed." David processed that in silence. "And you weren't going to tell me anything?" His mother looked at him with that serenity he now no longer read as coldness, but as what it had always been, a form of love that did not know how to make itself small to fit the formats he expected. "There are truths that if given to you, you won't receive," Mrs. Evelyn Tan said. "But if you discover them yourself, you cannot give them back." She paused. "You needed to discover this." "Mother," David said, and his voice broke on that single word in a way he didn't try to control. "How am I going to fix this?" The silence that followed was long. The roses swayed slightly in the wind. Somewhere in the mansion, Valentina's short, clear laugh could be heard, responding to something Auntie Mei Ling had told her in the kitchen. That sound reached the garden and settled between the two of them like an answer neither had formulated with words. "Start by stopping asking if you can," Mrs. Evelyn Tan finally said, "and start by doing." It was that afternoon when something happened that no one at the Fullerton residence had seen coming. David entered the room where Valentina was drawing alone, sitting on the floor with her notebook open and several pencils scattered around her with that ordered chaos that only makes sense to someone creating something. He stopped at the door. The girl looked up. "May I see?" David asked. Valentina studied him for a moment with that evaluative seriousness that disarmed him every time. "It's not finished yet," she said. "It doesn't matter." Another moment of evaluation. Then the girl turned the notebook towards him. It was a drawing of the garden, the roses, the stone bench, the path lantern, and, on the bench, two figures, one large and one small, sitting together with the exact space between them they had had the previous afternoon. David felt the air thicken in his throat. "Is that us?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Valentina looked at him with that direct expression that was both so familiar and so new. "You were crying," the girl said with total naturalness, without cruelty, like someone describing a climatic event. "I saw you, even though I pretended not to." She paused briefly. "My mom also cries sometimes when she thinks I don't see her. Adults think we children don't notice important things, but we do notice. We just don't always say something because we don't know if it's allowed." David slowly sat in the nearest armchair, not because he had been invited, but because his legs simply decided they could no longer keep him standing before such a simple and yet enormous truth. "Valentina," he said, and using her name still cost him something he couldn't name. "Does your mom talk to you about your dad?" The girl didn't flinch. She lowered her eyes to her notebook for a moment, and then raised them again with that honesty that asked no permission. "She tells me it's a complicated story," she replied, "that some stories need time to be told well." She picked up her pencil. I told her I didn't care if it was complicated, that she should tell me anyway, even if parts were missing, but she said that stories without the important parts do more harm than good. David felt those words pierce something central and permanent within him. "And what do you think?" he asked. Valentina drew a careful line before answering. "I think if a person exists," she said with that crushing logic of children who haven't yet learned to soften truths, then their story also exists, even if no one tells it, and sooner or later, stories find a way to tell themselves. The silence that fell afterwards was one that transforms the spaces where it occurs. David looked at that girl for a long moment. He looked at her small hands, moving over the paper with serene confidence. He looked at the tilt of her head. He looked at the way she held the pencil and made a decision. He didn't speak it aloud. He didn't make any dramatic gesture. He simply made it in the silence of that room, with the same clarity and irreversibility with which one makes decisions they know are right, even if they come late. That night, David called Siti before she left. He found her in the supply room collecting her trolley at the end of the day. Valentina was waiting in the foyer with her backpack on, reviewing something in her notebook with the infinite patience of someone accustomed to waiting. "Siti," David said. She turned around. David hadn't prepared a speech. He had no executive structure or negotiation strategy. He had only the raw truth of a man who had finally stopped hiding from himself. "I have no way to apologize that measures up to what I owe you," he said. "I know that, and I'm not going to try to compensate with words what only time and actions can demonstrate." He paused. "But I need you to know that what I did leaving that way, not having the courage to look for you, not being there, that had nothing to do with you. It had to do with my own fear, and carrying that fear over your life and over Valentina's life is something I'm going to have to live with." Siti listened to him without interrupting. Her eyes did not leave his for a moment. When David finished, there was a real silence, not awkward, not tense, simply real. "I didn't come here looking for an apology," Siti said. "I came because Valentina deserves to know where she comes from. She deserves to know her grandmother. She deserves to have a complete story, even if that story has parts that hurt." She paused briefly. "What comes after this, if anything comes, doesn't depend on you or me. It depends on her when the time is right." David nodded slowly. "Are you going to give me that moment?" he asked. "Are you going to let me be present when it comes?" Siti looked at him for a time that seemed longer than it was. "That," she finally said, "depends on what you do from now on, not on what you say." And in that answer was everything. The condition, the possibility, the half-open door, and the clear warning that no one was going to hold it open indefinitely. David nodded once more without adding anything, because there was nothing more to add. Siti took the trolley and went out into the corridor. David heard her footsteps receding towards the foyer. He heard Valentina's small voice asking something. He heard his mother's calm reply. Then he heard the main door open and close, and he was left alone in the supply room, among brooms and cleaning bottles, in the humblest place in that enormous mansion, feeling that it was the first time in years he was exactly where he needed to be. Upstairs in her room, Mrs. Evelyn Tan turned off her bedside lamp and before closing her eyes in the quiet darkness of her room, she murmured something so softly that only she could hear it. She was speaking to the empty chair on the other side of the room, to Mr. Andrew, to the man who had planted the roses and who had believed until the end that broken families could grow again if someone had the courage to water them. "It has begun, Andrew," she murmured. "It has begun." There was a wooden box in Mrs. Evelyn Tan's wardrobe that no one had opened in years. It wasn't a large or flashy box. It was one of those simple boxes where people keep what they can't throw away, but also don't know how to look at again. Old photographs, yellowed letters, small objects that once meant something enormous and that time had turned into relics of a previous life. That morning, Mrs. Evelyn Tan took it out of the wardrobe, sat on the edge of her bed with the box on her knees, and slowly opened it, as if inside there was something fragile that could break if moved too quickly. Inside were photographs of David when he was a child. David learning to walk. David with his father in the garden planting roses. David the day he graduated from school with that shy smile he later learned to hide behind the serious expression of a businessman. And beneath all those photographs, wrapped in a silk scarf, was a letter. A letter Mr. Andrew had written before he died and had asked Mrs. Evelyn Tan to keep until the right moment. "You'll know when it's time," he had said with that voice already weak but still firm about important things. "You'll know when our son will need to hear this." Mrs. Evelyn Tan unwrapped the scarf with trembling hands. She read the letter in silence, although she already knew it by heart. She had read it so many times in secret during the years of solitude that the words had been etched into a place deeper than the mind. When she finished reading it, she closed her eyes. "It's time, Andrew," she murmured. "It's time." That same morning, David had made a decision no one in the mansion expected. He canceled all his meetings for the week. Marcus Lee almost dropped the phone when he heard the instruction. In the years he had worked for David Tan, he had never seen him cancel a single important meeting, much less all of them for a full week. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked cautiously. "The board meeting with the foreign investors is critical. They've been waiting for months for this meeting. Let them wait a little longer," David replied with a calm. Marcus didn't know in him. There are things more important than business. It took me too long to understand it, but now I do. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "David," Marcus said with that familiarity only a long-time friend allows himself. "Are you all right?" "No," David replied with brutal honesty. "But I'm going to be for the first time in a long time. I'm going to try to be truly all right." He hung up before Marcus could add anything else. He stood in the study in front of his father's desk, looking at the pen he had held the other night. He picked it up between his fingers once more, and this time he didn't hold it as an object from the past. He held it as a tool for the present. Siti arrived at the mansion that morning without Valentina. The childcare center had reopened, and the girl had returned to her normal routine. Siti entered through the service door as usual, greeted Auntie Mei Ling with the same quiet courtesy, and prepared her trolley in silence. But Auntie Mei Ling, who had learned to read people during decades of working in that house, noticed something different in Siti that morning. A very subtle tension in her shoulders, a way of moving that was a little slower, a little more careful, as if she were walking on something that could break. "Is everything all right, my dear?" the cook asked, while kneading the morning bread. Siti looked up and smiled slightly. "Everything's fine, Auntie Mei Ling." But it wasn't, because the night before, Valentina had asked her a question Siti knew would come sooner or later, but which had still caught her off guard. "Mama, was the man from the big house looking at me like that because he knows who I am?" Siti had felt the world stop at that question. She had breathed slowly, looked her daughter in the eyes, and replied with the only truth she could give her at that moment. "I don't know, my love, but if one day you need to know, I will tell you when the time is right." Valentina had nodded with that small seriousness that characterized her. She hadn't cried, hadn't insisted, but something in her gaze had changed, as if a part of her childhood had taken a step forward without asking permission. It was mid-morning when Mrs. Evelyn Tan called David to her room. David climbed the stairs with his heart beating strangely. His mother never called him to her room. That was her private space, her refuge, the only place in the mansion where she allowed herself to be completely herself without the armor of Mrs. Tan. He entered. Mrs. Evelyn Tan was sitting in her armchair by the window with a wooden box on her knees. "Close the door," she said without preamble. David obeyed. He approached slowly, looked at the box, recognized some of the photographs peeking out from the edges. "What is this?" he asked. "Your past, Mrs. Evelyn Tan replied with that devastating serenity she wielded like no one else. "And your future, if you choose to accept it." She handed him the letter, wrapped in the silk scarf. David took it with hands that were not completely steady. He unwrapped the scarf, saw his father's handwriting. That slanted, careful script that had signed so many important documents and was now inscribed on a letter he had never seen. He read, and as he read, something inside him began to break and reconstruct at the same time. The letter was brief. Mr. Andrew had never been a man of many written words, but every word in that letter weighed like a precious stone. David, if you are reading this, it is because your mother believes it is time. And if you know your mother as well as I do, you know she is never wrong about these things. There is a mistake I made, and I regret not having corrected it when I had the opportunity. I asked you to come back from that town because the business needed you. That was true, but it was also true that I was afraid of losing you in a place so far from everything we knew. I was afraid that you would stay there, and that this family would lose the only son we had. That fear made me pressure you, and that pressure made you make decisions you probably didn't want to make. I don't know what you left behind on that trip. You never told me, and I never asked you, but I know my son, and I know there are things that weigh on you, things you carry alone because you believed it was what you had to do. If one day life gives you the opportunity to repair what was broken, do not let it pass. Businesses can wait, money can be replaced, but people cannot, and opportunities to do the right thing are not repeated indefinitely. Be brave, son, not in the easy way of being brave in a boardroom. Be brave in the difficult way of being brave with your heart. Your father who loves you, Andrew. David finished reading with eyes full of tears he didn't try to hold back this time. He looked up at his mother. Mrs. Evelyn Tan looked at him with an expression that mixed pain with hope in proportions only a mother can manage. He knew, David murmured, his voice broken. He didn't know the details, Mrs. Evelyn Tan replied, but he knew his son and knew you had left something important somewhere. She paused. He wrote that letter years before he died. I kept it until now because until now you hadn't been ready to receive it. David folded the letter with trembling hands, held it against his chest as if it were the only solid thing in a world that wouldn't stop moving. Mama, he finally said, I need you to tell me something. I need to know what Siti told you that first night. The words she whispered in her ear. The silence that followed was long. Mrs. Evelyn Tan took a deep breath, and then, for the first time since that story had begun, she revealed the secret she had kept like a treasure since that rainy night. She told me, she began, her voice calm but laden, you are not alone. Andrew is still here, in every rose he planted, in every corner of this house he loved, and in the granddaughter he never knew, but who has his eyes and his hands, and his way of looking at the world as if it were worth caring for. David felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. She knew, he murmured, from the beginning. She knew who you were. She knew who I was, and she came anyway. She came because she is a brave woman, Mrs. Evelyn Tan said. The kind of courage your father described in that letter, the courage of the heart. Her eyes filled with tears for the first time in that conversation. She came to give me back something I thought was lost forever. She came to tell me that I still have family, that there is still a future, that past mistakes don't have to define everything that comes next. David collapsed into the nearest chair. Everything clicked into place now. Every gesture, every word, every moment of that story that had begun, with an elderly woman crying alone at a table and a stranger who had dared to cross the line no one else crossed. It hadn't been a coincidence. Nothing had been a coincidence. Siti had come with a purpose, and that purpose was not revenge, not a claim. It was something much more powerful and much harder to sustain. It was love, the kind of love that cares even when it hurts, the kind of love that expects nothing in return but still gives everything it has. What do I do now? David asked. And in that question was all the fragility of a man who for the first time in years had no plan. Mrs. Evelyn Tan slowly rose from her armchair, walked to her son, and placed a hand on his shoulder with a tenderness she hadn't shown him in too long. Now, she said, you do what your father asked you to do in that letter. Be brave in the difficult way. That afternoon, David went to the neighborhood where Siti and Valentina lived. He hadn't announced it, hadn't planned a speech. He had simply taken his car keys and driven to the address Marcus had given him weeks ago in that report that now seemed like it belonged to another life. It was a modest 3-story building, with narrow balconies and clothes hanging out to dry in the sun, nothing like the Fullerton residence. But there was something about that place that breathed life in a way the mansion had long forgotten. He rang the doorbell of apartment 2B. Siti opened the door, saw him standing there with his hands in his pockets and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't the expression of the boss. It wasn't the expression of the investigator. It was the expression of the man who has left all masks somewhere along the way and arrives with nothing but who he is. "David," she said, and it was the first time she used his name without Mr. before it. "Siti," he replied. "May I come in?" She hesitated for only a second, then stepped aside. David entered the small apartment. He saw Valentina's drawings taped to the wall. He saw the books stacked next to the sofa. He saw the table where the two of them ate with only 2 chairs, and felt a pang in his chest as he realized all he had lost by not being there. Valentina was sitting on the floor drawing, and when she looked up and saw him, she wasn't surprised, as if she had somehow known that sooner or later he would arrive there. "Hello," the girl simply said. "Hello," David replied. Siti looked at the two of them with an expression that was difficult to read. David took a deep breath and then did something that changed everything. He knelt down. He knelt on the floor of that small apartment in front of that girl who drew with the same head tilt as him and spoke with a voice that trembled but did not give up. "Valentina," he said, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. And I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I ask you to listen to me." Valentina put down her pencil. She looked at him with those direct eyes that so resembled Mrs. Evelyn Tan's. And David, the man who managed empires, the man who never lost his composure, began to cry as he told his daughter for the first time in his life who he was and who she was, and why he had arrived so late. Valentina didn't speak the entire way back home. That night, Siti drove the public bus with the girl sitting beside her, looking out the window with that expression her mother knew too well. The expression of someone processing something big in a small space. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't anger. It was something deeper and quieter, like water moving beneath the surface without a sound. When they arrived at the apartment, Valentina dropped her backpack on the floor, walked to her room, and gently closed the door. Siti remained standing in the living room with her heart beating in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She knew that silence wasn't punishment. It was the silence of a girl who needed time to arrange the pieces of a puzzle she had just received without instructions. She didn't knock on the door, didn't ask if she was okay, because sometimes the greatest love is knowing when to stay still. An hour passed, maybe 2. When Valentina came out of her room, she carried her notebook under her arm, and her eyes were slightly red, but dry. She sat next to her mother on the sofa without saying anything. Siti put an arm around her shoulders and pulled her close with that tenderness that needs no words. "Are you angry with me?" Siti finally asked. Valentina slowly shook her head. "No," she said with that serious voice that characterized her. "I'm thinking about it." The girl opened her notebook, turned several pages until she reached the drawing of the garden she had shown David days ago. The 2 figures on the stone bench, one large, one small. "This drawing," Valentina said, "didn't have a name because I didn't know what it was." She paused briefly. "Now I know." She took her pencil, and at the bottom of the page, with that careful lettering she was learning to form, she wrote 2 words. First, encounter. Siti felt a tightening in her throat. "Do you want to see him again?" she asked carefully. Valentina looked at her with those direct eyes that always went to the heart of things. "Yes," she said, "but not because he's my dad. I still don't know if he's really my dad." She paused thoughtfully. "I want to see him again because he cried when he was with me. And people who really cry are the ones who really feel. And I want to get to know people who really feel." That night, while Valentina slept, Siti stayed awake, looking at the ceiling of her small room. She had imagined that moment, in many ways for years. She had rehearsed conversations, prepared answers, built scenarios in her mind of what it would be like the day Valentina knew the complete truth. But reality is never like rehearsals. And what she had just discovered was something no rehearsal could have taught her. That Valentina was stronger than she had calculated, that her daughter didn't need protection from the truth. She needed the truth accompanied, and that was completely different. In the Fullerton residence, David also didn't sleep. He was sitting in the study with the phone in his hand, looking at Marcus Lee's number on the screen. He had been about to call him 3 times that night, and all 3 times he had stopped his finger before pressing the button. Not because he had doubts about what he was going to ask him, but because once he said it aloud, there would be no turning back. He pressed the button. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Marcus, everything all right?" "Marcus," David said, without preamble. "I need you to prepare the paternity acknowledgement documents. I want them ready by next week." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked, with that professional caution that characterized him. More sure of this than of anything else I've ever done in my life, David replied. You need the mother's consent. I know, and I will ask her properly, but I want everything ready for when she says yes. And if she says no, David took a deep breath. Then I will wait. But the documents will be there, ready, reminding me every day of what I still have pending. Marcus didn't add anything else. He simply confirmed that he would have everything prepared and hung up. David put the phone back on the desk and looked at his father's pen. He picked it up between his fingers, as he had done so many times in recent days. This time he held it for what it was, a tool to sign the most important promise of his life. Then the next morning, Mrs. Evelyn Tan called Siti to her room before her workday began. Siti entered with that calm the elderly woman now knew well. Mrs. Evelyn Tan was sitting in the armchair by the window, hands on her knees, and an expression that mixed serenity with something that looked a lot like hope. Sit down, she said, pointing to the armchair opposite. Siti obeyed. Valentina knows, Mrs. Evelyn Tan said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Siti replied. David told her yesterday. The elderly woman nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for that confirmation. And how is she? Thinking, Siti replied with a slight smile. That child thinks more than she speaks. She always has. Mrs. Evelyn Tan smiled too, and it was a genuine smile, one she hadn't shown in a long time. She's like Andrew in that, she said. He also needed time to process before speaking. She paused. And she's like you. She has your strength. Siti felt something warm move in her chest. Mrs. Tan, Siti said carefully, I came here with a purpose, and that purpose has been fulfilled. You met your granddaughter. David knows the truth. What happens from here on out doesn't depend on me. It depends on everyone, the elderly woman replied, with that quiet wisdom that characterized her. But above all, it depends on whether we are willing to do the difficult thing. What is the difficult thing? Mrs. Evelyn Tan looked at her with those eyes that had seen so much and could still see more. Forgive, she said. Not just others, but ourselves too. That afternoon, David arrived at Siti's apartment without warning again. This time he carried something in his hands. A small, antique wooden box, the kind used to store important things. Valentina opened the door. She looked at him without surprise, as if she had somehow known he would return. Hello, she simply said. Hello, David replied. Is your mom here? She's here. Come in. Siti came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands with a cloth. She saw David standing in the living room with the box in his hands and an expression she couldn't quite classify. I brought something, he said. Something I want to show both of you. The three sat at the small dining table. David carefully opened the box. Inside were old photographs, yellowed letters, and small objects that had clearly been saved with love. This, he said, taking out a photograph. This is my father when he was my age, Mr. Andrew, the man who planted the roses in the garden. Valentina took the photograph with both hands. She studied it with that total attention she gave to important things. He looks like you, she said. And like you, David replied softly. You have his way of looking, of holding things, of thinking before speaking. Valentina looked up at him. He was good. He was the best man I've ever known, David replied, his voice breaking slightly in that sentence. And I made the mistake of not telling him enough when he could still hear me. He took another item from the box, a sealed envelope with Valentina's name written in a hand she didn't recognize. Your grandmother gave me this morning, David said. It's a letter she wrote for you. She says it's time for you to read it. Valentina took the envelope with careful hands. She slowly opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with elegant, firm handwriting. She read in silence. Siti watched her, holding her breath. When Valentina finished reading, her eyes were filled with tears that didn't fall. It says, the girl murmured, that she waited for me for a long time without knowing she was waiting for me, and that now that she found me, she won't be alone again. She looked up at David. And it says the roses Grandpa planted are mine too, that I can take care of them whenever I want. David closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were moist. Valentina, he said, and using her name still cost him something deep. I cannot change the past. I cannot return the time I wasn't there, but I can give you something no one else can give you. What? A future where you never have to wonder if you matter again, because you will know it every day in every gesture, in every word, in every decision I make from now on. Valentina looked at him for a long time. Are you going to stay? She asked. Or are you going to leave again when things get difficult? That question hit David in a place where he had no defense. "I'm going to stay," he replied. "Even if it gets difficult, even if I don't know how to do it right, even if I make mistakes, I'm going to stay." Valentina nodded slowly. Then she did something no one expected. She got up from the chair, walked around the table, and hugged David. It wasn't a dramatic hug. It was brief, firm, with the simplicity of true gestures that need no theatrics. When she pulled away, she had that serious expression that characterized her. "Okay," she said, "you can try." And in that sentence, in those 3 simple words, there was a door that was barely opening, an opportunity that came with no guarantees, but that came with something more valuable. The real possibility of being earned. 2 weeks later, something happened at the Fullerton residence that the staff would talk about for years. The empty chair in the dining room, the one that had remained unoccupied since Mr. Andrew's death, was moved. It wasn't removed. It was relocated next to the head of the table at an angle where Mrs. Evelyn Tan could see it, but where it no longer occupied anyone's place. And in its place, at the other end of the table, a new, smaller chair was placed, the exact size for a girl who was learning that broken families could grow again if someone had the courage to water them. That night, Mrs. Evelyn Tan, David, Siti, and Valentina dined together for the first time. Auntie Mei Ling prepared the meal with tears in her eyes. Uncle Raj passed in front of the dining room windows on his way back from the garden and paused for a long moment, observing the scene with a smile he didn't try to hide. It wasn't a perfect dinner. There were awkward silences. There were moments where no one knew exactly what to say, but there were also small laughs, glances that were beginning to meet without fear, and the clear sensation that something new was being born in the spaces that pain had left empty for so long. Valentina asked Mrs. Evelyn Tan about the roses. The elderly woman quietly told her how Mr. Andrew had planted them one by one with his hands in the earth, saying that deep roots were the only ones that survived storms. "Can I plant one too?" Valentina asked. Mrs. Evelyn Tan smiled in a way that lit up something in her face that had been dim for years. "Tomorrow," she said, "we plant one together," and she kept her promise. The next day, under the morning sun, Mrs. Evelyn Tan and Valentina planted a new rosebush in the garden. Uncle Raj handed them the tools with an expression of silent pride. Siti watched from the terrace, and David, who had cancelled all his meetings for that week for the 2nd consecutive time, knelt beside them and put his hands in the earth next to his daughter. Valentina worked with absolute concentration, following every instruction from her grandmother with that seriousness that characterized her. When they finished, the 3 of them stood in front of the newly planted rose bush. "What's this one called?" Valentina asked. Mrs. Evelyn Tan looked at David. David looked at Valentina. "You decide," he said. Valentina thought for a moment. Then, with that crushing logic of childhood, she replied, "New beginning." And those 2 words, spoken in the serious voice of a girl who was learning that families are built with time and with dirt under the fingernails, floated in the garden like a promise no one needed to sign. Because true promises are not signed, they are sown. Months later, when the rose bush had grown enough to produce its first flowers, Valentina completed the drawing she had started weeks ago. It was no longer just 2 figures on a bench. Now there were 4. An elderly woman with a cane, a man kneeling in the earth, a woman standing with her hands on a girl's shoulders, and the girl in the center holding a small rose bush with exposed roots. At the bottom, in increasingly confident handwriting, she wrote the final title, "The Family We Choose to Sow." And when her mother saw that drawing that night, after Valentina had fallen asleep, Siti held it in her hands and cried. Not from sadness, not from relief. She simply cried because she finally understood that everything she had carried alone for years, all the pain and fear and uncertainty, had served a purpose greater than herself. It had served to give a lonely elderly woman back the certainty that she was not alone. It had served to teach a lost man the way back home. And above all, it had served to give a girl something no money could buy. Roots. Deep ones. The ones that survive storms. The ones that blossom.